Today, we're going to be taking a look at epoxy, the final coat. You spent all that time building the rod, and the last thing you want to do is mess it up with a wobbly or bubbly or just bad finish. It's going to ruin the rod. This is RodBuilding. Let's epoxy like a pro. I'm Gary Benny, English rod builder living in Sweden. I've been building rods for many years, and now you're going to join me in my workshop going through tips, tricks, techniques, tools of the trade, all the things you want to know when you're coming to build a rod. We're going to drink a lot of tea, so join me on the ride. Let's have some fun. This is RodBuilding. Let's do this. We are going to talk epoxy. Now, I know there's lots of videos all over YouTube about this. Plenty of how-tos, do's, don'ts, but I always think that they're missing some fundamentals, and I think they overcomplicate it. It's not that hard to get a good finish. There's a few basic rules that people miss all the time, and within my job, I get asked a lot about this. So I'm thinking, let's go through the rules of making a good epoxy, then we'll look at what to do, and we'll do one at the same time. So rule one, if you've got really bad thread work, it's going to be a problem for your epoxy. You want to make sure the thread is nice and even, nice and flat, flowing over the feet of the guide and following the contours. If you have any stick-ups or sort of furry thread or gaps in the thread, that's going to be a problem. So that's rule one. And basically, that leads on to rule two. Rule two is you need everything to be flat. And what I mean by that is everyone seems to think the final coat is the most important coat. That's actually incorrect. The first coat is the most important coat. You're gonna let that epoxy soak into the threads, and you want it to be as level as possible. I see people trying to rush this. They've spent all that time making the rod look great, and they just rush it and mess it up. You're not trying to do it in one coat. You can do one coat wonders, but trust me, it's not normally the best. And any true rod builder will tell you that the best coats are always multiple thin layers. So rule two is apply a nice, even, thin first coat. Rule three is, as you've guessed it, a second coat. Now, normally, if you use the right epoxies and you use the right thicknesses and your first coat is level, the last coat is very easy because all you're doing is following the contours. You're going over with a slightly thicker epoxy and flowing up over, and it will self-level. These are self-leveling epoxies, so you shouldn't have to manipulate and work it too hard. If you're having to do that, there's a problem. So if you're going to be wrapping larger framed guides with thicker threads, for example, maybe you're going to have to do more coats. So there's going to be, let's say, a rule 4 and a rule 5, but realistically, it's only one last rule, and that is your final coat. No matter how many coats you need to do them evenly and light. That's the best. So I think the best thing we can do before we start epoxying is just look at a few things that make life easy and rules to avoid issues like fish eyes and bubbles and stuff. Just some simple techniques, how and how not to do. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to bake a cake. No, we're not going to bake a cake. I'm going to show you some stuff that you can use that's going to make your life easy. Now, there's going to be different capacities to your rod building. There's going to be guys who are going to be wanting to epoxy, lots of epoxy over big, heavy-duty saltwater rods, for example. Guys want to do really thin layers for fly rods, very finesse rods. Everyone's going to use a different amount of epoxy. The one thing I would say though that is paramount with doing your epoxy work is, firstly, you need to have the rod clean from dust. So I would recommend a dust extractor, turn it on, get rid of the dust in the air, and also another top tip is get yourself a tack rag. These you can pick up pretty much anywhere. They're like a sticky rag, and all you need to do is very gently, on the area you're gonna be epoxying, is just sort of brush it over, and that's just gonna help you remove any surface dust on the top. That's gonna help the epoxy. I normally then just tuck it away in a little plastic bag, and every time I come to do my epoxy, just make sure there's no dust hanging around. So we've got that nice clean rod and we're ready to do some epoxy. Now, one of the things that I've noticed people do make a mistake on is understanding what epoxies to use when and why. Now, there's loads of different epoxies and everyone's gonna tell you, I prefer this one, I prefer that one. And I will be very honest with you, I've used the majority on the market and I think that every single one works, but you just need to know how to use it. Some have a longer setup time, some have a different mix rate, some are a little bit more thin than others, so you just need to get used to it. And once you find an epoxy you're good at working with, stick to it. The one thing I would say though for the second tip is that people do want to rush. They want to try and put too much on all the time, and that is a big mistake. Less is more. Like I said, the first coat is the most important coat. For me, I always start off with a medium or light build. The reason for that is I want to coat all the threads and fill in around all the air pockets around the guide feet, and the lighter epoxies will do that better. I don't want to use a high build where it's going to be thicker and maybe the air and the bubble release isn't going to be as good. So go across with a very light coat first, let it soak in, go up the rod, go back down the rod, and that's done. Make sure it's level and you're good. Before you apply the epoxy though, we need to think about mixing and stuff like that. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about this because it's been said 1,000 times. You want to be mixing your epoxy 50-50, you want to take it easy to mix it. Some people use mixing machines. I use the end of a plastic brush and just mix the epoxy gently, trying not to get too much air bubbles into it. So the next step is the most important in my opinion, and it's about where you're going to be applying the epoxy from. Some people choose to do it directly from the plastic cup, but that isn't the best in my opinion. It's got no heat dissipation. You want to get the epoxy spread out and as thin as possible. It's going to help with bubble release, and it's also going to make the pot life, how long it's going to take to go off, a little bit longer. And there is things available on the market. You've got these like little foil trays. These are available to buy in most RodBuilding shops. They're really good. They don't take a lot of epoxy. So if you're doing a lot of rods and you need a lot of epoxy, they're a bit small. So what I tend to use is either these kind of like small food trays. You can get them from most places. They've got a bit of a larger surface area. And they've got nice deep sides, so that's good. If you're really going to be doing some serious work on like saltwater rods and you want a lot of epoxy, these are pretty good as well. Or the ultimate, in my opinion, is you just simply get some tin foil and you wrap it over a plastic plate. Now, this is what most sort of full-time builders will do. It's very easy. You get a huge surface area, good heat dissipation, the bubbles come out, and when you're finished, you just simply crumple up that tin foil and you can dispose of it easily. So that's a top tip from me to you, is always try and get the epoxy as thin as possible to get rid of those bubbles. Another tip which is really important is the temperature of your room where you're doing the epoxy. I keep this thermometer in the room. You can see it's not measuring out, I've cut that off, and it's 26.8 degrees. So it's pretty warm in here. Most people come into the rod shop, they take their jumper off, I can tell you, and the humidity is quite low. You don't want to have too much humidity, otherwise it's also going to be a problem for the epoxy. You want it nice and warm. That's going to help with bubble release. It's going to make it really clear, and also your set time is going to be faster when it starts to go off. So don't do it in a too cold environment. It's going to take too long and you're not going to get good results. So remember that, keep it warm and keep it clear. My last top tip for you before we do our epoxy is dust again. I can't state this enough. You see here, I like to keep my brushes in these dust-free containers. That's just going to make sure they're not going to get dirty. You never know what's flying around in your rod shop. For both size brushes, and I even keep all my mixing cups, all my trays and everything in a plastic box to make sure that everything keeps dust free. So that's another just top tip, just keep it clean. So now I've just pulled 6 centiliters of each epoxy. I like to mix quite a lot. It's going to get a better mix. Again, I'm not going to go in how to mix and everything like that. You can find that anyway. Just take it easy, mix it evenly, try not to get too much bubbles, and when the marbling has gone between the two, you know it's ready. Simple as that. So now we've poured the epoxy out on the tray, and you see it's going to be dispersing out like this over a nice large surface area, and that's going to mean the bubbles are going to be easy to come out. If the bubbles aren't coming out so quickly, what you can do is apply a very amount of gentle heat, just like this over the top, and you'll see the bubbles will just come out. So when the epoxy is clear, you can do 2 things now. You can wait a little bit for the epoxy to thicken up if you want to do, like slightly thicker coats, or like now I'm doing a first coat, I don't want it too thick, I want it to be quite light. So we're just going to start getting it on the rod and evenly coating it for that first coat. And it's as quick as that. That's the first coat. I'm just going to go over it very, very gently and just kind of work in the epoxy into the threaded areas, and I don't really worry about trying to make the contour too flat right now. I'm literally just going to make sure that it's going into the thread. I'm gonna go up to the other guide, get that one done, then I'll come back and have another look at this one. Make sure you get the epoxy in around the guide feet, keeping it nice and thin, nice and flat. And if you need, on these bigger guides, just to put a little bit of epoxy there, just to make it go in, you'll see it'll bubble out, and just fill it in very carefully. Applying some epoxy and just letting it soak through. And always remember just to take it off. You don't want too much on there, so don't be scared, just to take it all back off, and then keep going over until you get a really nice even coat. So when we've done our first coat, what you might see is some bubbles coming out around winding checks and the thread that you've done. Now you don't want to be worrying about that. You just want to, again, with a very light heat, just touch it, and you'll see it'll completely disappear and go clear. You're just going to help those bubbles to pop. The epoxy will go slightly thinner for a few seconds, and it's absolutely perfect. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to go over again and just make sure that it's all nice and level. And so for the first coat, that's pretty much it. Not much more to it. We just have to wait for it to dry now, and then we're going to do our second coat and make it absolutely perfect. So now we've got the coats really nice and flat. That's 3 sections, all coated up on first coat. So we're going to drop them up onto the drying rack and leave them for the time it needs to dry. So another little tip is when you're doing your blanks, when you're using these kind of rollers, and most people use a roller or a V of some sort, I like to put a little bit of tape over there because they will leave a little bit of a black mark when they're rotating for so long. I'm sure you could get some other wheels that don't mark up, but I've not found any yet. So a little bit of tape there just stops any marks, and you can remove it later on the blank. So now we're going to look at final coat. This rod here, a different rod than we've been doing, has had first coat, and it's pretty flat, it's pretty good. But I have noticed a few little things on it that need to be addressed before we can do our final coat. And we refer to those as stick-ups. So you need to check over the epoxy, and I can see here there's 2 little areas where the tie-offs or whatever is just sort of pushing the epoxy a little bit, and it's not really that good. Now, that's something we try to avoid, but it does happen, so that's why I've chosen this one to show you. If you look here, you can just see these little stick-ups, and all we need to do is remove them with a very sharp razor blade. Just remove them until they feel a little bit flat. Just rub them across, gone. Now she's ready for the final coat. So now we're on to second coat, and this is the most important. I've got a rod here that I already did first coat on before. It's really nice and flat, as we said. It's dust free. I've made sure we use a tack rag just over this first coat to make sure it's really, really clean. And now we've mixed up some high build, which is a little bit thicker. And I can tell you now, this is already almost perfect. So that simple, clean coat of high build is going to make it really good. Another quick thing is to make sure your rod is level when you're doing it. If you've got a really wobbly rod while you're rotating it, that's going to make life a bit harder. So let's crack on. We're going to heat the high build a little bit to make it more fluid and apply our final coat. Now, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so I spend a lot of time, really trying to make sure it's level so I get it perfect. And I think it's worth that extra time. If you see a bit that looks like it's a little bit too high, you can just rub it over with a brush, but remember, it is self-leveling, and if you've got that first coat level, it's gonna look perfect. So that one's gonna look amazing. So the rod is now ready. Just taking it off the drying rack, sort that one up, and it's looking absolutely fantastic. Those tips and tricks we've said, this is exactly the result you're gonna get. Really clean, flat finish, no stick-ups, no dust, glassy, clear epoxy. And that is absolutely key. I'm looking over it now, everything looks really good, no bubbles by the hook keeper, really nice round lines, straight lines where we're doing it on the power wrapper. And it's not that hard, as you see. All you need to do is think a little bit before you start. Take your time, follow the tips and tricks I've laid out for you, and your epoxy will also look as clean and clear as this. That's epoxy like a pro. This is RodBuilding, and that was a wrap.